deep inside, there's a huge part of me that's gone.
The horror is once you get out, trying to get back what you'd lost.
When you're on that side of the bars and there's no way, there's no hope, there's no crack, you give up.
Took away a big portion of my life, took away my life with my children.
I mean, what happened to the word investigation?
Helpless, fear, anger, and revenge, and wanting people to be held accountable for what had happened to me.
And why? Why did you do it? What possessed you to play God?
I knew my life was over right there.
Having my family taken away, everything taken away from me.
I had my life stolen away for 25.5 years for a crime I didn't commit. You can't get that time back.
Hi, I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lozon.
And this is Real Life Wrongs, where we dive into the stories, the crimes, and the hard times of the complicated world of wrongful convictions.
Episode 6, Look Away. Highlight case, Thomas Sophonow. Guest, Andrew Mikolajweski.
Today on Real Life Wrongs, we'll be looking at police misconduct and the impact it can have on the outcome of a trial. This is the first of a 3-part series. Officials are a big topic. Our focus at Real Life Wrongs is where crime meets the law and how we can do better. The police are our first point of contact.
Policing is a hard job. These are the people who choose to deal with all of the things that the rest of us don't want to. They're often the front line who protects us from dangerous people and traumatic situations. We ask them to enforce the law. Most police officers do their job with integrity and respect, but we know that there are instances where this isn't always the case. Today, we're examining police misconduct as it occurred in the case of Thomas Sophonow. Our next episode in the series covers a first-hand account of internal misconduct, and the last in our 3-part series addresses PTSD in the force.
The year is 1981. You're driving halfway across Canada, somewhere between Vancouver, BC, and Winnipeg, Manitoba. You're driving your 1971 Monte Carlo about 1,800 kilometers with the hopes of visiting your 2-year-old daughter. It's almost Christmas. You arrive on December 23rd with Christmas gift in hand. You knock on your ex's front door. She refuses to allow you to see your daughter. Disappointed, but tired, you leave your gift and drive away. Before you head back west, you take your car in for service, and while waiting for your brakes to be changed, you head over to the local store to buy some Christmas stockings with candies and toys to hand out at the children's wards at a few local hospitals. You make a quick call to your mom from a payphone at 7:52 p.m. When your car is ready, you head back west. Knowing that it's going to be a long drive, you grab a coffee at a local coffee shop and head back out on the road. Within a couple hours on the road, you hear a radio broadcast. A young girl has been murdered in a coffee shop in Winnipeg. You're alerted by this because you just stopped at a coffee shop and you wonder if it's the same one you were just at. This question won't leave your mind, so you call your sister to ask her if it was in fact the same coffee shop. You're relieved to hear that it wasn't. You continue on your drive back to BC. When you get to Hope, BC, you see a poster for a missing girl. You think you may have seen her when you were in Winnipeg. Wanting to help, you call the RCMP with your tip. The RCMP takes a formal statement and forwards it to the Winnipeg police to follow up. Little did you know, the police wouldn't only look into your tip, but they would also look into you. When they pull up your identification photo, it strikes the officers as bearing a resemblance to the suspect in the Stoppel murder, the young girl murdered in the coffee shop. They start interviewing a number of your contacts in Winnipeg, and based on the information they gather, namely that you were in Winnipeg on the day of the murder, you're known to carry a knife, you own a cowboy hat, and you were upset because you couldn't see your daughter, and you resemble the suspect's description, namely the cowboy hat, you have become a person of interest in the investigation. You're then brought in for questioning on 2 separate occasions. While the first interview is relatively uneventful, during the second interview, you're subjected to horrifying interview techniques. You are not informed of your right to counsel. You are inexplicably subject to an aggressive strip search during the interrogation, and the interrogation becomes so coercive that you become convinced that you murdered the victim. After the interrogation, you're arrested and transported to lockup. Your trial begins in mid-October. The prosecution presents a variety of evidence suggesting that you are the murderer, but they're careful to leave out the questionable police practices that landed you in court in the first place. In early November, a mistrial is declared because the jury can't come to a unanimous decision about your guilt. This is the story of Thomas Sophonow, and his story has more twists and turns than the 1,800-kilometer trip he took to visit his daughter. Okay, Kelly, police misconduct is a pretty wide-ranging term. So what are we talking about?
So one of my sisters is a cop, and she's respected by her community because she respects them and she respects the badge. Problem is, some people hide behind the badge to do things that aren't acceptable. And in these cases, who do you turn to for help? Who's supposed to protect you when it's the police officer who's misbehaving?
So we're talking about the illegal or unethical actions that police officers take while in the line of duty. And what makes this even more troubling is that these actions often violate a person's constitutional rights. So it's evident that our trust and confidence in the police are put to the test when they act outside the boundaries of the law. So what are some examples of how this occurs?
There are so many possibilities. The list, it actually almost seems endless. But let's just say it can include things like using excessive force, discriminatory harassment, false arrests, unlawful stop and searches, and obviously, any of these things could drastically increase the likelihood of a wrongful conviction. But another side of police misconduct that's more insidious and hard to detect is what some academics have coined procedural perjury. And this is when the police lie about the circumstances of an arrest or an interaction with someone to make sure that the evidence they've collected can be useful at trial.
Okay, so we have a bunch of constitutional rights to protect us from unlawful searches or arrests. And we have a bunch of rules and procedures in place to prevent us from being prosecuted unfairly. So if the police have overstepped their bounds, but want to make sure that they can still use this evidence against you that they've collected, they may have carefully reconstructed the details of the event to their advantage. Is that right?
Yes. And one study that was conducted, and it was done under the promise of anonymity, because we don't want fear of reprisal. So the study found that somewhere between 25 and 50% of officers misrepresent facts or flat out lie to ensure the case can move forward. Problem is, in their mind, the lies may be necessary because they help them do their job, right? To punish people who are guilty of crimes.
Right. And again, made evident in the public's lack of trust in the credibility and integrity of the justice system. Are we talking about big lies or white lies?
It's all kinds of lies. But usually they'll lie about having consent to do a search, or they'll lie about having probable cause. And this can extend to planting evidence in plain view to give them probable cause to keep searching. They could include false facts in the police report. They might lie about having informed the suspect of their rights. So questioning might take place without them even knowing that what they say can and will be used against them. But, I think the important thing here is that it really doesn't matter what the lie is about, because if they're willing to lie about one thing, what other rules are they willing to break?
Right. Well, the National Police Misconduct Reporting Project in the United States estimates that almost 1 in 5 officers will be implicated in an act of misconduct during the course of their career.
It's a little bit terrifying, to hear that. And there was a study done by the Wisconsin Innocence Project, and they found that police misconduct was a factor in almost 50% of wrongful convictions that have been confirmed by DNA. And do these lies contribute then? Well, how much of these lies contribute to wrongful convictions? Like you just said 50%. Right. I mean, those are the ones that we know. And again, like I always say this, and I always feel like it's a cop-out, but, with all things wrongful convictions, it's near impossible to quantify and to know, right? But when it comes to police misconduct, there were 2 large-scale police scandals, one in Los Angeles, California, and one in Tulia, Texas. And these 2 scandals exposed levels of corruption that mimic the best fiction stories, right? The best, the worst, call it what you will. So following the investigations into those police forces, almost 200 people were exonerated, and these aren't the only examples we have, right? Headlines over the past 20 years, some before, some after LA and Tulia, they've brought police misconduct to our attention. And when we look at all of these cases, we're talking about 1,500 additional wrongful convictions. Right. That may not be the exact number, is it? I mean, it's a big number. We're talking, this is what we know about, and this is what's reported. But I mean, it could be even bigger than this. Mm-hmm. Right. And I mean, it's interesting because the overwhelming majority of the literature on wrongful convictions looks at serious crimes, the murders and the sexual assaults. But what these mass cases of police misconduct show us is that there's a huge group of people who've been wrongfully convicted of lesser offenses, right? Like most of the LA and Tulia cases were drug or weapon possession related offenses. I should say planted drug or planted weapon offenses, right? And this is where the accused pled guilty to a lesser charge. Mm-hmm. And to understand more about the pitfalls of plea deals, we also have a plea deals episode to see how those sort of lesser charges end up, leading to these wrongful convictions. So had it not been for the discovery of the widespread culture of misconduct in these departments, we would never have known about them. So in a way, this kind of doubles the problem where on the one hand, we have rampant cases of misconduct among the police. And on the other hand, we have hundreds, maybe thousands of people who have been wrongfully convicted because of this misconduct. And we often just may never hear or know about them. Fortunately, we were able to speak with retired Detective Sergeant Andrew Mikolajweski on the subject of police misconduct, but also in depth about the Sophonow case.
It started back in 1981. This all has to do with the murder of a 16-year-old girl by the name of Barb Stoppel. It happened at an Ideal Donut shop in Winnipeg on December 23rd, approximately 8:20 in the evening. It was just a normal night, with the exception of one person that happened to have been stalking her that day. She was supposed to be getting off work, I believe, at 9 o'clock in the evening. But according to numerous witnesses, somebody with a cowboy hat was seen going into the donut shop, locking the door, and causing a lot of people to be very suspicious of what was going on inside. The lighting inside the store was nothing better. It was perfect. So they all had a very good view. It was, like I said, 8:20 in the evening. I don't believe there's any snow that night, but it was a winter day in Winnipeg. And witnesses became more and more suspicious about the time it was taking because they wanted their coffees or whatever. And I believe one person actually went and phoned the donut shop to find out what was going on, and there was no answer. Having seen the young waitress in the store and the stranger with the cowboy hat, they became very suspicious. One of the witnesses went and got her husband to go to the door and stand there waiting to see what was going on. At this time, which was, I say, just after 8:20, possibly 8:30 in the evening, the cowboy, or person with the cowboy hat, came to the door, turned the unlocked the door, and walked out, saying the store was closed. Norman Janor, the primary witness at this point, was very suspicious and went to the rear of the store and found the door to the washroom, female washroom, was closed. He opened the door and discovered Barbara Stoppel's body laying on the floor. And that began the investigation into the murder of Barbara Stoppel. One of the main witnesses at the time, was used in the prelim and all the three court hearings, was a man named John Dirksen. He allegedly followed the suspect halfway across the Dominion Street Bridge in Winnipeg and confronted him. A slight scuffle ensued, and the suspect threatened that he was going to throw a knife at him. John, not being used to this kind of this going on, he decided that he was going to leave and go back to where he was selling Christmas trees in the shopping lot.
Oh, so he actually had an interaction with that person. Okay.
Yes. And oddly enough, the police were called immediately, but instead of going directly to the police and telling them what he knew and that he was chasing the intruder across the bridge, he decided to go and allegedly get a taxi and start looking for him himself. Failing to find the suspect, he decided to go home and have a few beer. And this was your prime witness. He later became more and more curious about what had happened to the waitress inside the store, so he went to the St. Boniface Hospital to see if she was okay. At this point, police learned that he was a witness, and he directed him to the location where he had the altercation with the suspect. It was at this time that investigators located a cardboard box underneath, below the bridge in the snow, and also 2 pairs of gloves. Those gloves were linked to the murder of Barbara Stoppel. And the suspect who was inside the store at the time was seen leaving the Ideal Donut Shop with a cardboard box. So there you have you know the direction of travel the suspect was going in. You have his gloves, which is fantastic, and the twine that was found with those gloves, cut pieces of twine, was also located around Barb Stoppel's neck. She was choked to death she wasn't choked to death, but she was choked, and in an attempt to tie her up with 2 common knots around the neck. She did succumb to her injuries, I believe, 4 or 5 days later, and passed away. And then began the manhunt. Right.
Now, how did you find an interest in what was going on? Like, where did it start for you?
Well, it started for me basically that night. I was living in Winnipeg, in River Heights, and it caught the attention of everybody, not just the media, but all the people in Winnipeg. Because Winnipeg at the time was a fairly innocent city, although we had our fair share of murders. This was something that really rocked a lot of people, because it was a young 16-year-old girl who was working by herself in a well-lit area, and it really disturbed the confidence of the people in Winnipeg. Mm-hmm. And it's very true today that death demands an answer. And everyone started searching for an answer, like we do today. Someone is murdered, the Winnipeg police will go down the air right away and say, well, this person was known to police. This person was frequented illicit areas, that sort of thing, was a known drug user. And it kind of makes us feel better about ourselves because there's a reason why this person was murdered. It just gives them a little bit more normalcy to our lives. In this case, it's a 16-year-old innocent girl that was murdered, and for whatever reason, we did not know.
And so just talk to me briefly about the beginning of your search.
My search didn't begin until 1999. The murder happened in 1981. 19 years later, Tom Sophonow was convicted of the crime. He went through a preliminary hearing and 3 trials. In the end, he spent, I believe, almost 3 years in jail. But one of the final conviction was overturned, and everybody thought he got away with murder. He demanded in 1986, begged for somebody to reinvestigate the murder and find out who the true killer was. At that time, the police said we had the right killer, and there's no need for this. And the common theme was this man, Tom Sophonow, got away with murder. He went and wrote letters to every politician he could, including the NDP government at the time. I believe the Attorney General for Winnipeg was Roland Penner, and he wrote a letter back to Tom's lawyer saying that there was no need for an inquiry. Now, what most people didn't understand at this time, this is 1986. The real killer is going to kill again in 1 more year, and again and again. So there's a chance even in 1986, 5 years after the murder, that they could have stopped him from killing over and over again. They didn't happen in Winnipeg. One happened in Calgary, another one in British Columbia, actually 2 possibly in British Columbia, and sexual assaults all across Canada. I was working night shift, driving around in the streets of North End, Winnipeg, as a supervisor, and I got the message that I was selected to go and reinvestigate the case after 19 years. Now, there's lots of rumors about why the case was even put up for review again. But I think it had a lot to do with Tom Sophonow, who got the home phone number of the new premier, Gary Filmon. And he went on a radio show with Peter Warren and asked for everybody who thought he was guilty to phone the premier and demand that he be charged again. And he also demanded or begged for people who thought he was innocent to request that the investigation be reviewed again. Well, needless to say, the premier got a lot of phone calls and changed his number and ordered a review. Or asked the chief to look at the review. The chief went and talked to John Birchall, our crime analyst, and said, "You want to look at this file again, please, and have a look at it and see what we should do." So John Birchall reviewed the file and said that at the time, Tom Sophonow was still a viable suspect, but it should be reviewed. So that's when myself and Bob Legg were taken out of our respective divisions. Bob was working at the police academy, and I was working in the North End of Winnipeg in uniform. And we formed a team in 1999. Very excited about doing this. I was given a file, the Birchall report, they called it, to review, some 120 pages. And we were assigned to go, I believe we started in October of 1999, in a makeshift office on Empress Street. We got together that morning and immediately sat down, and I don't think we even have a pen between us. Maybe some pieces of paper, not that which did us any good. And we reviewed the case. And oddly enough, I was really eager to look at a very interesting whodunit, because this had stumped police and investigators for quite some time. And I was very disappointed, because after 2 hours of reading the file, I actually looked to my partner, who was to the right of me, and we both just shook our heads. Because after 2 hours, we knew who the killer was, and it was not Tom Sophonow.
What was it that presented that way for you?
Well, when I say it was 2 hours, it definitely was. After we came to the same conclusion that this man's innocent, and this guy over here has been murdering and raping women across Canada for the last 19 years. I mean, this isn't just my police experience that would tell me that this person's innocent. It's any person with average intelligence would be, having reviewed the file just for 2 hours, would know for sure that this guy didn't do it.
So give me an example of what you were reading that was just so obvious that it wasn't him. And then also, how did you was this other person available to you? Like, was there a file on the real killer? Like, how did you?
There was a file on the real killer going right back to 1981 and before. He was well known. He was classified as basically a classic psychopath with numerous issues. When you're asking me how we knew, we had to formally come together and document what we called an autopsy of the investigation. So we took apart the investigation, not within 2 hours, although we knew it was not Tom. We had to take apart the investigation in totality so we could prove it to the inspector and everybody else involved. Yet they got the wrong guy. And we did this by starting off with the murder weapon. We had the murder weapon, the twine that was wrapped around Barb's neck. Where do you go with this? Well, right back from the beginning, the Winnipeg police believed that the twine came from British Columbia and believed it was used with BC Hydro. So your murder weapon comes from British Columbia. Your suspect possibly could come from British Columbia. Unfortunately for everybody involved, they didn't test the twine. The testing of the twine back then would have cost $100. They didn't do it, and no one to this day has answered why.
And you've asked?
Well, we did it. We tested the twine in 2000, and it came from Portage Prairie. It did not come from British Columbia.
Okay.
So that initial connection between the suspect and the twine was void.
Okay, so we start there.
So it was initial assumption on the part of investigators that the twine comes from BC. The end, we're not looking any further.
That's correct.
That's infuriating. Anyways, carry on.
They even brought in an expert to say that it seemed like the twine, but they couldn't say that it was the twine. And you can tell where the twine comes from because companies will actually inject certain dyes to identify whose is whose.
Oh.
That's how we knew it came from Portage Prairie. So right from the beginning, the most important part of your investigation is your murder weapon. And they got the wrong province of where it came from.
Every single time they tried it. Single time they tried him.
Yes.
It was based on a false assumption.
That's correct.
What's next?
From that frustration, we have to introduce Tom Sophonow. Tom Sophonow didn't come into this investigation for, I think 2 or 3 months. But he was in Winnipeg on the day of the murder, trying to visit his daughter. Tom Sophonow lived in British Columbia. He came down for Christmas to give her some gifts. So that put him in Winnipeg on the day of the murder. On the way back from Winnipeg,
same day? Was it the same day when he returned?
The day after, or the same night. I believe it was the same night that he left.
Uh-huh.
The very day that she's being murdered, he was planning to leave to go back to Winnipeg. Unfortunately, he had some issue with his vehicle and ended up being in the Canadian Tire on Pembina Highway, some 15 minutes away from the donut shop, which became very crucial. And luckily for him, and luckily for us, he phoned his mother from the Canadian Tire store, and I believe that was at 7:52. And the call ended at 7:54, I believe, which put him at the Canadian Tire store 15 minutes away on the day of the murder, and approximately 22 minutes away, 20 or so minutes away from the time that Barb was attacked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that may have been the most important phone call he ever made. Tom Sophonow can document exactly where he was several parts of the day, including crucial parts of the day, because at the same time Tom's trying to go see his daughter, a cowboy with a cowboy hat, cowboy boots, dressed exactly like the person who was seen inside the donut shop with a pockmarked face, is seen all over the Dominion Shopping Center. At times that Tom Sophonow was definitely not there. Some of these witnesses were not used in court because they didn't seem to jive with what the police needed for the right times.
And this is the shopping center where the Ideal Donut Shop is?
Yes.
That right? Okay.
Right. So the times are all seem to be out of sequence, and I think they even maintained. I think there was one person that saw the person with a cowboy hat, cowboy boots, etc., pockmarked face inside her store at 5 o'clock. That person, that witness, was used in the composite drawing. So police were 100% sure that was the same person. But yet Tom couldn't have been there. He was with another family, and it was documented, and there was a phone call made. So he had an alibi for 5 o'clock. So it couldn't have been him.
Now, how close was he in description to the actual killer?
when you making descriptions from people who were not trained investigators there's no real trained eyewitnesses. So you get you can get a lot of good information. Was it male or female? That's something you can probably determine. Was it indigenous person? Was it a white person, Filipino? That sort of thing. You can narrow down your fields. In terms of height, weight, and that sort of thing, it's fairly ambiguous. But the one thing that kept on popping up was the physical description. Not just that, but very personal description of pockmarked face. Tom Sophonow did not have a pockmarked face. He had a baby face. The real killer
still does, from what I've seen.
Yes. The real killer was seen with the pockmarked face by people very close to the donut store. There was that heavy acne, and the real killer had very bad acne. So we have all these people. The times seem to be not falling in line with what the police wanted, but you have to understand that when they presented this information in court, they didn't have to present people that necessarily saw this alleged cowboy at different times of the day because of full disclosure. Back in the 80s, there was not full disclosure. The Crown could present the information they had, but not everything had to be shared with the defense. And that didn't happen until 1991 in a ruling on Stitchcomb, where then you were forced to give full disclosure to the defense. It didn't happen back then.
So how did Tom become known to the police in terms of this investigation originally?
On his way back from Winnipeg that same night, he stopped in, I can't remember where, but there was a poster of a missing woman or missing girl. And I can't pronounce her name and I can't remember it offhand, but he decided to phone the RCMP and let them know that he might have seen her in Winnipeg, very innocently enough.
And this is a completely different person. This isn't Stoppel.
Absolutely. And so he decided to phone the RCMP, provide his information saying he was in Winnipeg on that night or that day. And he also gave, but oddly enough, he gave a Winnipeg address. Okay. I guess where he was staying in Winnipeg. I'm not sure why. The RCMP contacted Winnipeg and Winnipeg decided to follow up on it. In order to follow up on it, they had to go and check his address. And in so doing, they realized that he didn't live in Winnipeg, and that was actually from British Columbia. And they also determined that, hey, this guy was in Winnipeg on the day of the murder, and he comes from British Columbia. You've got your BC connection. Because of Twine, apparently, he's coming from British Columbia. So Tom, innocently enough, entered into the investigation.
And the investigators think they're connecting the dots. Like they think they're being superheroes here and connecting some really obvious dots.
Yes. And they even spoke with Tom's wife or ex-wife there, Tom was trying to go see his daughter. The ex-wife wouldn't let him do it. So they had a confrontation on the phone, hung up, that sort of thing. So the investigators actually went and spoke with Tom's ex, who said that Tom regularly carried a knife. Tom is known to be violent, although he was never violent with her. And he was very upset that he couldn't see his daughter. And she, oddly enough, even said, I thought that composite drawing of the suspect in the Stoppel case looked a lot like Tom. So now you're getting Tommy in Winnipeg on the day of the murder, was really mad he couldn't see his daughter, and carried a knife. And we know the suspect had a knife on that bridge. And these are the things that the police were getting.
And he owns a cowboy hat.
Yes, he was known to have a cowboy hat as well.
Mm-hmm.
So armed with that little bit of information, they contacted. And this is the very interesting point. When you're building a house, if you don't get like something very, very small right, like an air vent, okay, $50 air vent, if it's not put in properly, it will leak. If it leaks, it can go inside your walls. If it gets into your walls, you're going to have mold. You get mold to go into your carpet, et cetera, et cetera. It's very important to do everything right at the beginning. Winnipeg police did the right thing. With the information, ordered it off to the RCMP, to Vancouver police, because Tom was living in Vancouver. They gave the information, some of the information to a Detective Barnard, and that's a very important name because he pops up in another wrongful conviction. Detective Barnard was asked to go and interview Tom. He interviewed Tom, but he made some. This is basically the second wave of factors that led to him being even stronger suspect. They talked to Barnard went and allegedly took a statement from Tom. He unfortunately made some critical errors in what he did. He told Tom that his fingerprints were inside the donut shop. That was a lie. Tom remembered that he was in a donut shop when he left the city. Admitted that, but he thought it was a Tim Hortons or whatever. So now Tom's very confused because he claims that there wasn't a young girl in the coffee shop, and that his prints should not be there. And then it was also inferred that his prints might be inside the woman's washroom. Once again, this officer is giving Tom information about a murder that he shouldn't really know and shouldn't be providing. So Tom's going, can't be right, because if my fingerprints are going to be inside that shop, it's on a coffee cup, maybe a spoon. So he's getting confused, and he's already been told by a policeman that his prints are there. So now he's going I must have been there if they're telling me my prints are there. Now, there's another issue with the statement, alleged statement that Barnard took from Sophonow is it's not his words. Barnard basically did a summary of what Tom told him. Tom signed it and said it. He claimed to me that he didn't even read it. But the issue was this: when we're taking a statement, we try to do is get a pure virgin statement. Don't talk. Don't say. You can ask questions later, but let the person say what they know and then ask questions later. In this case, that was not done. And you can tell it was not done because Tom Sophonow does not use army time. And this was 1,400 hours this, 1,700 hours that. None of these were his words. And also, he made the comment that Barnard wrote down in the statement, I could have been at the Ideal Donut Shop on that day. He's saying that because he was already told that his fingerprints were there. But that was really damning. This information gets passed back to Winnipeg. Winnipeg goes, okay, this is really looking promising. Winnipeg sends out 2 detectives to go and interview Tom. Now, this brings in another wave of issues. The 2 people that interviewed Tom, allegedly, the interview lasted several hours. There was even one point.
Where was he being interviewed?
In Vancouver.
At the station?
Yes. The issue there was something I found out immediately as well, because I read the statement, is it's when I read the statement between the 2 investigators and Tom Sophonow, it takes about 20 minutes, which make no sense to me because the actual interview lasted several hours. Halfway through that interview, Tom Sophonow was strip searched, which should never have happened. That's what you do normally when you have a drug arrest and you have to do cavity searches. This, to me, was a psychological ploy to break him down. And in the inquiry, the judge agreed.
Yeah, because I was going to say there would be no reason if you're just interrogating him about a crime that happened months ago, right? You're not. Right. There's no reason to do a cavity search, and this is something that sticks with me because, you try to rationalize this, but I cannot fathom any reason other than trying to break him.
Yes, and the judge agreed.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, the damning issue for Tom here was he was somehow led to believe that he might have been at that place. In the statement, it says that he might have been at the Ideal Donut Shop, conferring what Barnard had already found out or put in his statement. So that's there. But now you've also got another issue because it's documented in their report, the 2 officers' report, that Tom Sophonow, I'll go ahead to the next wave of impropriety here. After they finish with that interview, they still want more evidence against Tom Sophonow. So they have him put in a cell with a undercover officer. At this time, Tom Sophonow allegedly, and actually I can't say allegedly because Tom admitted it. Tom Sophonow, and I'll show you right here what he did to me, says that during tells the officer, the undercover officer, I believe his name was Constable Black, that basically summarizes what the offense was, not necessarily saying he did it. He says that Barb Stoppel was stabbed and that he apparently turned the lock and to lock the door, and that twisting motion was another damning issue for Tom, because how did he know that there's a twisting motion and that's how the lock was used? You know, it was one of those wiser kind of nut locks that goes like that. So
I would imagine anyway. Anyone would maybe.
That's what his defense would say, but unfortunately, Tom would tell me later, why did you use that motion? Because it was damning against you. And he got up on the table across from me and he said, they did this to me over and over and over again. And they said he did it. You did it. And this, of course, none of that's in the statement. Because of that, he repeated the turning motion to Constable Black, which damned him even more.
Yeah.
But it was still a circumstantial case, and he was charged and brought back to Winnipeg, where things would get even worse. Your next phase your next phase is going to have leading to the wrongful accusation and conviction of Tom Sophonow, was bringing him back, and we were introduced to the eyewitnesses. I'm talking about all the people, including John Dirksen, who was wrestling with him on the bridge, including the people who were watching from outside the donut shop. These people had to be shown. Well, they had statements all from these people indicating when they saw the person inside the donut shop, et cetera, et cetera. Now they were going to show. Some were shown a live lineup with Tom Sophonow in there. Others were shown what we call gallery packs, photo packs, where you look at these pictures and say, can you identify the suspect in this? And even the judge would agree with me that the photo lineup was flawed. When I mean flawed, you could tell who the subject, the focus of the attention should be in this picture. They even said, I guess it's probably going to be this one here because he stands out from the rest. Basically, that's what was happening. So we find out later, yes, that whole photo lineup was flawed. Not only that the live lineup, where Tom was brought in with several other people, he stood out. I mean, you focused your attention on him. And people were, initially, these witnesses said, if anything, I'd say it would be number 7, which was Tom Sophonow. Now, the key witness who fought with the killer, John Dirksen, he said, I don't know which one it is. So he witnesses a live lineup, and he can't identify Tom Sophonow as the killer. John Dirksen tells me in the year 2000, almost 19 years later, he was told by an officer, that's him, Tom, that's him. You've got to do this, do the right thing. And the person he was referring to was Tom Sophonow. But John didn't do it because he couldn't. He just couldn't identify me. Now that's the John Dirksen's tainted issue here. It goes even further, because John Dirksen was wanted on a warrant of committal. That means he owed a fine. It was $107. Okay, so this is John Dirksen that can't identify Tom Sophonow in the lineup. All of a sudden, he's arrested on a warrant of committal of $107. He's got the money at home. I've done this before. You get a check mark showing that you got an arrest on a warrant of committal. You go there, you get the money, you take him to the remand center, he gets to go home. It wasn't done at this time. They wanted, well, I won't even say what they wanted. This was very suspicious because they took him to the remand center and they locked him up on a warrant of committal when he had the money at home. Coincidentally, he happened to bump into none other than Tom Sophonow. At this time, he said, ask the guard, is that the guy in here for the Stoppel murder? At this time, he has a positive identification. And he testified at the prelim and all 3 trials that Tom Sophonow was the one he saw in the donut shop. Tom Sophonow was the one that he was fighting with on the bridge. And I'll tell you right now, before fast forwarding ahead, after I talked to John Dirksen, he says he couldn't identify anybody that he was fighting with. He'd lost his glasses that night. Not only that, he identified a person shortly after the murder as being the twin, it's being the killer that he fought with on the bridge. And if it wasn't him, it was his twin brother. I've seen that picture. It looks nothing like Tom Sophonow. It doesn't even look like the real killer. So basically, John Dirksen admitted he couldn't identify anybody and was just trying to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
But really, what he ended up doing was selling out Tom Sophonow for $107.
Well, no, he had to pay that fine.
Oh.
But there was really no reason for him to have been inside there if he had that money.
Yeah.
And then you had other witnesses. You had a guy named Norman Janauer. He was there outside the donut shop and eventually found Barb Stoppel's body first. Great guy. He couldn't identify Tom Sophonow in the photo lineup.
What was his name again?
Norman Janauer.
Oh, Norman. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah.
He said, if anything, it would look like number 7. So that's not a positive identification. But he did ask the officer that was next to him if he had picked out if number 7 was the person they were after, and he was told yes. Psychologically, you just implanted something in this guy's mind that is the guy. It's not. I'm not going to criticize Mr. Janauer because lots of issues are at play when you are a witness. And I'll give you a prime example. No, because I just want to draw an analogy that none of these witnesses wanted to be the center of attention here, and they were. I did a police lecture a few years ago, actually on the island here, and I had the students. Now these are students that want to be policemen. They're keen observers. They're really interested. I had to watch an interview of a serial killer. And I said, watch how they interview him and the interrogation skills they use. This went on hour after hour. There's just 2 people in this video, and they're talking for hours. At the end of the video, I asked them which hand did that suspect have a ring on? All of them said left, because that's normally where you have your ring. None of them said the right, and it was on his right and his left. He was married to his wife and to the armed forces, and he had those rings. Then I asked him what color was the belt that he was wearing. Every one of them said black. I think one said brown, but there was no belt. They had to take the belt off before he went to the interview room. The same thing with his shirt. I asked were the horizontal stripes or lateral, and it was a 50-50 mix. And I can't remember what it was, but it just shows you these are people sitting back, having coffees, enjoying life, and watching video for several hours and not picking up much of anything. Now, you've got other people outside this donut shop that have a split second to identify somebody down the road. It's incredibly hard.
But your example also shows that you have people watching this video for several hours and they're not picking up on anything except the things that you're implanting as the interrogator, for like, you know what I mean? You're questioning them, but you're planting ideas like what color was his belt? You know that there is no belt, but the very fact that you ask them what color's the belt, they immediately feel the need to fill in that blank, right? Rather than say there is no belt.
That's correct.
And that's the same thing I think that was happening with in the Sophonow case with the witnesses.
Yes, especially with the times. The times were very, very crucial because the closer we had the times, the later we had the times, the better for the police and the Crown, because Tom's going to go and hop in that vehicle of his and drive as fast as he can to get to the donut shop, murder Barb Stoppel, make his car disappear, and then run across the bridge because his car wasn't in the lot. That was another factor. I mean, they took all the licenses down of every vehicle in there. And I told this to Tom. I mean, Tom, because he asked me, okay, well, like you asked me as well, why did you think I was innocent? And I comically went through the whole thing again. Said, oh, Tom, you got so upset that you couldn't see your daughter. You hung up on your mother. You drove as fast as you could to the donut shop. You murdered Barb Stoppel. You took $33, even though you had a couple $100 in your wallet. Then you went outside, you had this wand, and you made your car disappear, and you took off across the bridge. And that's how ridiculous the whole thing sounded.
Wow.
And the other big difference between the real killer and Tom Sophonow is about 6 to 8 inches in height. Tom is a tall man.
Now, in any of those lineups, was he wearing a cowboy hat when no one else was?
I do not remember seeing the lineup. Okay. So I can't answer that one.
Mm-hmm. I thought I read that.
It was known that he did have a cowboy hat, but
it was the only thing seized in the search.
Yes, they see that back in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. Actually, no, you can't say that either, because they also took his girlfriend's underwear. And we don't know why, because they aren't saying anything. We interviewed his girlfriend at the time, and she said that was the other weird thing that she thought, why would they take my underwear?
There are so many whys with this case.
And
it's just, that's it. Like, there are just so many questions. And when you think you have an answer, it raises 3 more questions with this case. Like, it's just ridiculous. And like you said, you and your partner, within 2 hours, you realized how ridiculous the case was.
Yes.
And, you know, hindsight, looking at it, you can't help but think how ridiculous it is.
Yes, but I did also happen to see this is even more disturbing, in the Crown's file. Back in those days, there'd be 4 different copies of the report. The white copies for BPR, and then the pink copies, I believe, was for the Crown Attorney. So they kept their own file. So let's pretend that I know the Crown Attorney's file could have been 1,000 pages long. But so they had their own file, and then we also had one in the police records. But within the police file, the pink copy that we looked at, I found a handwritten note, and I thought it was a Crown Attorney that wrote it. I found out many years later, actually just a couple of years ago, who did write it. But it was basically the 360 degrees of Tom Sophonow's guilt. And it shows you exactly where they placed all the important things to show that he was guilty. I'll give you an example. Like, I'm reading off it right now. It's in Winnipeg. Because he was Winnipeg, that was 10% of guilt. Because he had fit his description, that was 30%. He knew the area, that's another 20%. Eyewitness account, I thought it was only 40%. They had 52.5% for the twine, which is a big 0 because it didn't come from British Columbia.
And it was never checked.
No, not till 2000. Then we have the police statements, and et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, that's what they did to show his guilt. So we decided to do the autopsy of the investigation and hammer each and every one. And when in the end we were left with nothing, just like motive. There was no motive at all. So we were left with nothing. And that was from a brief read over 2 hours. We knew that, but now we have to go and document absolutely every reason for why we believed it and prove it. Dig up the fact that John Dirksen identified somebody that he said was the fitting image of the killer. Or if it wasn't him, it was his twin brother. Well, that was never entered into court. They could have destroyed John Dirksen's ability to identify if they only knew, but the defense didn't, because there was no full disclosure.
How long did it take you to dismantle it?
Well, 2 hours after we realized that was done, it was basically, I think it was, did I say it was 5 or 6 working days? It was 5 or 6 working days from the time that we knew he didn't do it to the time we presented it to the inspector. And then I started rolling, go, oh my God, okay, what are we doing here? Are you guys sure about this? Yeah. And more importantly, because we got 2 things going on here. If he didn't do it, then who did? And that was painstakingly obvious.
So, I mean, can you talk to me about the informants? You mentioned the one person who was beside him in the cell.
That person, that was a policeman, so I can't really say he's an informant. But I think there was a list of 5 separate people that were used. Some used for his information, some went to court, some didn't. But basically the police realized that the case was so fragile against Tom that they needed more. And you could show how desperate they were when they went to thieves, sex offenders, and liars. And that's basically who your jailhouse informants were. So these 5 people had varying degrees of input into the court proceedings. What we didn't realize until later is there was one more jailhouse informant. And that was the real killer of Barb Stoppel. And you can imagine how much of a thrill it was giving information that Tom Sophonow admitted to killing Barb Stoppel. And you are the real killer. He just wanted to get out of jail a bit early.
Yeah.
And we found that out in 2000 when we went to Tom's lawyer's office in Toronto and went through the entire file case and found out that the real killer had tried to give evidence against Tom. I talked to Tom afterwards, and he says he can't remember ever meeting the guy. And I showed him the picture. He didn't recognize it.
But he could give the most detailed account of a made-up conversation he had with Tom Sophonow because he would have all the details of the crime.
Correct. And that would have been
unbelievable.
That would have been the biggest miscarriage of justice to have him testify.
Yeah.
What have you said his name?
Oh, the real killer, his name is Terry Samuel Arnold.
Okay. Where is he now?
He's cremated.
Okay.
Now he passed away. He passed away 2004 or something. 2000. He took his own life. He was put on suicide watch about an hour after I spoke with him last. We spoke for 3.5 hours. And in the book, I call it 3.5 hours into the abyss, I think, because it was just very disturbing.
Well, and when we spoke, you had said during this conversation that he essentially confessed to the crime in theory, right? Like that he walked you through theoretically what could have happened, but it was essentially walking you through what did happen. Correct.
You see, I remember during the conversation we had several, but the last one was very interesting because he said, you have to understand me. I can never confess to anything. I can deal, but I can never confess to anything. And he wanted to offer me insights into his mind to explain things to me. And basically that's where we took it. I wanted to get him away from the I'm a policeman, you're the criminal sort of thing, and go into role playing. Say, well, let's pretend you're the policeman. What do you think happened here? And then that started him off talking about why he would have gone to that donut store. He said, I wouldn't have gone there. It wouldn't have been a robbery. You know my record. I do not do robberies. I would have gone there to sexually assault. The stealing of the $33 was an afterthought. And that's basically as close as you can get to the truth from him.
What was in the cardboard box? Was there anything of relevance there?
Not really. Just coffee stir sticks, that sort of thing. And maybe some creamers, just insignificant things. But that's what he was like. He was a patrick.
Unreal.
And the sad part is, back in 1986, when Tom Sophonow was released, you have a chance to review the file. But everyone is so adamant that he did it. And basically the investigation is suffering from massive tunnel vision. Everyone figures he just got away with murder. They didn't do it. Because of that, the tragedy has another avenue it goes down to. But if you were going to pretend that this is a Shakespearean play, you'd have many, many tragedies in it. The first is the murder of a young, beautiful 16-year-old girl, and how her family has to suffer for years afterwards. The second is a wrongful conviction of Tom Sophonow, and him suffering forever, including today. And the third is what cost by not reading the file. How many other people suffered for it? He murdered again in 1987, murdered again in 1988. He sexually assaulted one 8-year-old girl over 100 times in 3 months. He sexually assaulted a 10-year-old in the Maritimes, a 12-year-old in the Maritimes, and a 14-year-old in the Maritimes. This went on and on forever. And it could have been stopped. In 1986, when he begged for somebody just to review the file. One of the worst, something that really gets me is a quote. It's better to be slapped in the face with the truth than kissed with a lie. There's a whole bunch of kissing going on here. Tom Sophonow was told, really sorry about that, Tom. This is after, around the time of the inquiry. He was told, we're really sorry about this. Sorry this happened to you. We dug up new information that was not available at the time. That's a lie. There was no new information whatsoever, unless you're telling me that reading was invented in 1999. It wasn't. Everything was available back then as it was when we started doing our review. As a matter of fact, in 1985, during the final trial of Tom Sophonow, Two other witnesses were located by the late Greg Brodsky. These two people saw Terry Arnold in the donut shop on the day of the murder, wearing a cowboy hat, wearing cowboy boots, bothering a waitress around 1:30 in the afternoon.
So was he in there at 1:30 and at 5 and then again at 8?
He was there after 8, yes, but the one times that I had recorded there was, I think it was around 1:30.
Okay.
And he was bothering the waitress, asking if he could go and serve people, that sort of thing. But how do you know that this was Terry Arnold? Well, because one of the witnesses, lived in the same apartment block as Terry Arnold. She knew his name. She knew him personally. Two fantastic witnesses. They were going to use these people, and that information was actually shared. Brodsky shared it with the Crown's office. So the Crown knew about this potential other suspect, which leads me to another point, that when we went and reviewed the file in the Crown's office, there was, let's say, 15, 20 pages with Terry Arnold's name in it in the report. It could have been on page 20, 40, 80, 90, 100, all separate throughout the report. Somebody took every page out and stapled it to the back. So I'm thinking somebody figured it out and did nothing. And my supposition is that because we had our own Crown attorneys, we asked them if they did it, and they said no, they didn't. So somebody previous to 2000 had to have gone through the file, taken his name out, put it at the back of the report, and to me that something was wrong. We explained everything that we had to the city lawyers. City lawyers looked at us and said, "You guys will not be testifying." In inquiry, Justice Corey had no idea that this investigation only took 2 hours to come to a conclusion. He thought there was new information that came to light, and the police were still working on an ongoing investigation, in quotation marks. Well, we weren't doing anything.
Yeah.
So we could have testified and let them know. And I think the Thomas Sophonow's compensation might have been a lot larger had it been known that back in 1986, he should have got his wish, and somebody should have read the file. Not to mention a class action lawsuit on the police, on all the other victims that fell afterwards that didn't have to suffer.
Now, are there repercussions? I mean, when you talk about this guy, Barnard?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so he lied.
Well, he didn't lie. He didn't lie. He did something that police did back then. It's just do a summary and have the person sign it. It's still done a little bit today.
Okay.
You get in a car accident and you have to give a statement to the police. Let's say on the scene. Basically, you'll say the police will actually help you. I was going eastbound on this street, and I came in collision with this, and they'll help you out with a statement. You don't do that in a murder case. It's basically you're imputing things that this person is not saying. That was just the first issue, especially when he's being told that Tom Sophonow was being told that his fingerprints are inside the donut shop. That's a lie, and you can't do it. As a policeman, I can deceive. There's nothing wrong with deceiving, but I'm not supposed to lie.
Right. So were there consequences?
No, not to my knowledge. And that's something that I've talked to Tom Sophonow about this. It's something that he still agonizes with. He went to jail for something he didn't do. A lot of people might have done things that weren't proper ethically or even criminally. And there has been no consequences to any of them from what he was saying. I wasn't there in the interview room when he was interviewed by the two policemen, Polishon and Warwick. Only 3 people know what happened in that room, and I'm not one of them.
So what laws protect all the people involved in this case from any discipline then?
It's not necessarily laws. It's like you have to prove criminal intent. And I mean, one of the major ingredients for having a wrongful conviction is for police to believe that they have the right guy. There's no crime in that.
Yeah.
How do I'll tell you that I think that this case of Tom Sophonow may be one of the biggest, most disturbing cases or acts of omission by a police service in the history of Canada. All they have to do is read it instead of being so pompous as to think they were right. Just review it.
Yeah.
And that frustrates me because back in 1986, when I got out of jail myself at the same time that Tom Sophonow did. I was working in Stony Mountain Penitentiary, and he got released, and I got released. I became a policeman. But back then, I had to go to recruit class and do all these stupid marches. If they let me out of there and excuse me for just 2 hours, I could have. It would have been so easy to see that this is the wrong guy.
Yeah.
Back in 1986, what we did, you could have assigned somebody, and I think back then you weren't making a whole lot of money. I think it would have cost maybe less than $100 to get somebody off the street and review the file for $100. You would have known back then.
Well, and you were even saying, yeah.
I know that some people will say hindsight's 20/20. Well, you tell that to that young 8-year-old girl that was raped over 100 times and see how comforting that is. That 8-year-old girl was threatened. If you tell your mother what I'm doing, I will kill her and I will kill you. And she lived in fear for that. I mean, the damage is done.
Yeah. It's horrifying. In terms of informants, is there anything that you can tell me about how that works? Why we would even listen to thieves and murderers on the stand, and how, when we know that there's a deal being made, why do we allow this?
With an absolute lack of forensic evidence, you've got to reach for whatever you can. And I'm looking at the file here, and not the file, but this little note, photocopied note, and jailhouse informants is 52.5% on the 360-degree cycle of guilt. So they relied heavily on that. And it's a zero. I mean, when you have somebody that can gain something from giving a statement, it's worthless.
Yeah.
But I will say
you wouldn't take someone off the street who had something to gain, and you would strip away their credibility. But meanwhile, you allow an informant of that.
And this was the 80s. There's an awful lot of problems with investigations back then.
Yeah.
And I will be wholeheartedly honest with you. One of the times I interviewed Terry Arnold, the real killer, he was double bunked in a segregation cell there in British Columbia. And now I hate jailhouse informants, but I couldn't leave that prison without talking to the guy. I promised him nothing. I said, I just want to know if he said anything, that's it. And he came forward and said, no, he hasn't talked to me at all. He's just all to himself. But I'm going I had the urge to ask. I mean, you have to do it because you're there, but I'm not offering this guy anything.
Yeah. Yeah. But if you had, perhaps he would have started speaking, but it wouldn't necessarily be the truth.
Exactly.
Yeah. That is just, and are they used as frequently today then as the chaos of the 80s?
We've grown up a lot since then, and we rely, I think we're very cautious about eyewitness identification now because we've become a little bit more scientific and empirical. Yeah. And it's the use of jailhouse informants is very limited. The Crowns and police actually try to stay far away from that.
Do you know, was that something that's just sort of always been in the system, where wherever you could get information, no harm, no foul kind of thing? Like, it wasn't like, well, the first time they used a jailhouse informant. It's just sort of always.
Yeah, it's a very slippery slope, as testified in Terry Arnold was actually convicted of murder in 1991.
Oh, okay.
Of a young girl named Christine Brown. And the only way for them to do this was they set up a Mr. Big sting. Which again is
one of them worked.
Yes. This one, I watched it and it looked legitimate.
Okay.
They pretended to be Hell's Angels, and they took him out. Once he left prison, they wanted to befriend him. They took him on certain jobs, that sort of thing. They gave him money. How did that work now? Anyway, they brought him to Mr. Big one day.
All the good stuff, right? I mean, it would be very difficult to Mr. Big a sociopath or a psychopath, wouldn't it?
Yeah, but it worked. He got to Mr. Big, and they said, "We want you to work with him, but we've got this issue. We have a guy on the inside, the RCMP. He says you're a suspect in the murder of Christine Brown. We can make that go away. We've got a guy in prison right now who's dying. He's got cancer. One of our guys, one of the Hell's Angels, and he's willing to take the fall for this. he was out in the public at that time, but we need to know all the details of the murder. He fell for it. He told them about the murder, said he raped her, murdered her, and they flew him to that area. And he pointed out where the area where she actually was murdered. So he had knowledge of where her body was.
Yeah.
I think he even found her shoe. Now, when he was convicted of that, and oddly enough, as a sociopath, he's sitting in court while everyone's testifying. He's reading a novel, totally disinterested in everything going on. And at any rate, while we're doing our investigation in 2000, he's got an appeal going. And he won the appeal because there was not full disclosure, believe it or not, in what the RCMP had done. So you've got full disclosure, non-existence for Tom Sophonow that absolutely screwed him. And now you've got full disclosure hurting this investigation on someone we know did the murder.
Yeah.
Full circle. But that's the way it is.
It's not a perfect system.
No. The detective involved in the investigation decided to destroy exhibits in 1986 and take exhibits home.
Common practice?
No. Within 24 hours of the decision coming down that Tom Sophonow could not be tried again, this person went to our stores unit twice and destroyed exhibits and then took some home.
Okay. And was he held accountable for that?
No, there's a short story for that as well. I realized we didn't have all our exhibits. We brought him in to our office. His name was retired Inspector Ken Beener. Brought him into the office, and on one occasion he mentioned that he kept certain trophies on the case, from the case.
Okay.
But he didn't elaborate. I said, well, we have to re-interview him because he says he kept trophies and we're missing a bunch of exhibits. So I went to the chief, the inspector, everybody else along the chain, and I said, we got to get a search warrant for his place because we're missing these things, and he's already indicated he may have some. Matter of fact, we were looking for Tom Sophonow's hairs that were seized as part of the case. Our crime analyst was instructed by our sergeant, Blair Vogan, to go to Ken Beener's place to get them. And this is right after I've already said, I know he's got exhibits, we should get a search warrant. John Birchall goes to Beener's place, gets the hair samples. Ken Beener says, I don't have anything else. John leaves and we've got our sample back. After 19 years, he's been holding on to hairs.
Are you kidding me?
So I demanded to get a search warrant. It would have been a very easy one. Judge would have easily granted it. And they said, no, he will not do it. He's a retired inspector. So my frustration, I kept on pushing for this, but they said, what you can do is you can phone him up, have him come down, give his notebooks, and ask him if he's got anything. I said, well, I can't do that unless I charge and caution him. And they said, you will not charge and caution him. And that was the rules. So I phoned him up and I said, explained to him, we had a new suspect. We needed all the exhibits. I knew we had them. We have to get this solved, et cetera, et cetera. He came down and he spoke with us for about an hour. He gave me his notebooks. Then I convinced him that we really need the exhibits, no matter how small they may be. And he, at this point, says, well, I must admit, I took exhibits. I've destroyed some, but the rest are in my trunk of my car outside. So we followed him out to the truck of the car, brought out a box of exhibits, put them on the table, and one by one, he brought them out, including, my jaw almost dropped when he took a belt out of the box. And I asked him, is this the belt Barb Stoppel was wearing when she was murdered? And he said, yes. I said, was it ever tested? He said, no. Then I asked him, where is her bra? I don't know. Where's her underwear? I must have destroyed it. So we're still missing lots of the exhibits, which basically made it a confession case. You can't convict anybody of this crime because exhibits are missing. So I went back to we had a meeting with the chief, deputy chiefs, all the lawyers, and I explained what happened. And one deputy chief, I will never forget, said, we should charge him. I said, well, I can't. I didn't charter him. You guys told me not to. So I can't charge him with anything. And then they said, well, why don't we get a search warrant? I said to get a search warrant. He's given stuff back. Now I can't say that I have knowledge that he has more exhibits. I'm done. They tried to forward it off to Internal Affairs to have them go do a warrant, but they didn't have sufficient grounds either. So it basically went for Crown opinion, and the Crown decided down the road, I think it was an external Crown, decided that there was not necessarily no evidence to prosecute, but it wasn't in the interest of justice. I guess that would be because it's been so long, he wasn't chartered, the guys blew it.
And so he had like his own trophies or whatever, souvenirs from many cases.
I don't know. No one got a search warrant. I don't know what's there. We're getting a search warrant to go do another entry, and I'm giving information to a judge. The judge just came back from a holiday with friends of his, whose son was the boyfriend of Terry Samuel Arnold's sister.
It's too connected.
Yes.
It's too connected. And also that you found that Sophonow and Stoppel are possibly related.
Yes, they are. Well, they're genetically related. When I'm doing that, there's DNA, which is basically better than the fingerprint.
Yeah.
There's also mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mother to son and daughter.
Okay.
But once it's passed on to the son, it ends. It can only be passed down from mother to children.
Okay.
And we compared Tom Sophonow's and Barb Stoppel's mitochondrial DNA are linked, which means that somehow they are genetically related. It could have been 1,000 years ago, but somehow that started. Right. And that was just another part of the story that, quite frankly, if I didn't go through it, I wouldn't believe it. The thing that gets me the most is the real killer, Terry Samuel Arnold, was involved in this case days after her attack. Yeah. He was phoning in tips on other people, and people were phoning tips on him. He even went to the hospital. This is one of the greatest tragedies of all. He went to the hospital and actually spoke with Barb Stoppel's mother. Asking how she was doing. In reality, all he wanted to do was, I got to find out how she's doing, because if she's alive, I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
And he said that he used to be a truck driver, he was a truck driver, and he'd seen Barb at the donut shop several times. And they should have caught up on this, because she'd only been working there a few days intermittently. And more importantly, check this guy. He's not a truck driver. He doesn't have a truck driving license. He's got a beginner's license. So how can you say you're a truck driver? Immediately, they should know that this guy's lying, and they didn't check. Another fault.
And does her mother remember speaking to him at the hospital?
Yes, I spoke to her about that. Unfortunately, the years went by, and the tragedies continued and mounted and mounted. Before I wrote the book in 2016, I had to ask permission from Rick Stoppel about when the right time would be, because his mother had been going through the prelim. She went through the first trial, the second trial, the third trial. Then she went through the inquiry, and she didn't want to hear about it anymore. And the time came because Rick Stoppel went to see his mother and showed her a picture and asked Muriel, that's her name, Muriel Stoppel, what do you think of this? Do you know who this is? And she said no. And it was a picture of Barb Stoppel, her daughter. So she had dementia and had forgotten.
Yeah.
And that's how the case ended, not with a bang, but a whimper.
Yeah. Yeah. Very sad. Very sad. And where is Tom now? What's Tom doing?
Tom's living in New Westminster. He's got doing quite well. Well, I shouldn't say doing quite well. He bought a house for way back then for about $500,000. You can imagine what it's worth right now. Yeah. But in many ways, he's still locked into this case. He's helping other people with wrongful convictions, but he's not Tom Sophonow. I've told him this before, so I'm not going behind his back. He's not Tom Sophonow, the father. He's not Tom Sophonow, the husband. He's Tom Sophonow, the wrongfully convicted. And that's an image you can't get out of. And he's kind of locked in that for the rest of his life.
Yeah. Yeah. Is he angry?
He's angry in a sense that he went through all this spent time in prison for something he didn't do.
Yeah.
And yet there were so many acts done by others, ethical or criminal or whatever you want to say, that were never punished.
Yeah.
And that is the case for most, if not all, wrongful convictions.
Mm-hmm.
You can prove you're just trying to do your job and you thought it was him. What can I say? And oddly enough, each and every one of the people, investigators, Crown attorneys, everybody I talked to, claim that they never read the entire report. So what kind of a police service doesn't have anybody assigned to read the report? Yeah. It still blows my mind that homicide investigation won't have somebody read the entire report. And there's one thing that keeps on coming back is the silence. They will not, to this day, no one from the Winnipeg Police Service has actually come out and said, yeah, we didn't really have new evidence. This was something we should have done within 2 hours way back when. No one's come out and said that. No one from the Police Service has ever apologized to that young girl who was raped over 100 times. No one's apologized for the murders. No, there's been absolutely no accountability.
No.
And now the only thing they'll say is it's an ongoing investigation, which is what they do parallelly to all these other investigations. I've got a couple here. You've got a young girl, 11-year-old girl in 1970. That's 52 years ago. Her name was Geraldine Sete. She was murdered. The family, to this day, I was on the phone with them just last week, to this day cannot get answers from the Winnipeg Police Service because they say it's an ongoing investigation. The same thing is true with a murder that happened in 43 years ago, 1979, a girl named Irene Pearson. Once again, the investigation stalled and they won't tell people what's going on. So it's very important, I agree, that we should hide certain things from the public in a homicide investigation. But just having someone sit down after 50 years and speak with the family and say, this is what we have, this is what we failed you, we lost exhibits, give them some closure. And I got a feeling that in a lot of these cases, they've lost exhibits. Because if they lost it in this case, they'd likely have lost it in the other ones.
Yeah.
They cannot come out and say it because they can't lose face.
That's right. That's right. But they lose faith. They lose face anyway.
But I was taught in the academy that in a homicide investigation, the most important person is the victim. You look after the victim and that person's rights. They have a story, and it still has not gone past that. I thought that was the primary goal. Unfortunately, when you look at all these cases, the primary person of importance and entity importance is the service. Don't lose face. We're not going to wear this.
Yeah.
And that's sad because, I imagined with a case of Barb Stoppel, I could see this over and over again. All these people, especially during the inquiry, the Crown attorneys had lawyers, the police had lawyers, family had lawyers, Tom had lawyers, everyone has lawyers. And they're talking, bickering back and forth about this should be done, that should be done, whatever, and blame to each other, pointing fingers at each other. And I can imagine each and every one of them inside that woman's washroom at the donut shop with Barb Stoppel laying there with their backs turned to her and only thinking about themselves. And that's where it all ended up. And that's a tragedy.
I was so excited to speak with Andrew. To have someone with his experience be willing to open up with us seemed too good to be true. Who better to speak about a botched police job than someone who was assigned to look into it? And, I have to say the conversation lived up to the hype. When we first spoke with Andrew about the case, there were times when I literally fell back in my chair and my jaw dropped. I was dumbfounded by the details of the investigation. And I think it's easy for us to look back at this case 30 years later and say, well, it's pretty obvious that, this wasn't right and Sophonow wasn't the person. But, we're not privy to all the stuff that's in the file. I can only imagine what it must have been like to have access to all of that, to look through it, and to see what your colleagues, your platoon mates had done to this poor man. Thing is, I think there was more misconduct happening than he ever saw coming.
In a lot of cases where officials are acting out, it's usually because there's a culture or an environment that allows it or maybe even encourages it.
And it's never easy to hear stories about your heroes acting poorly. And I can't speak to what the culture was like in Winnipeg at the time, and I can't pretend to know what it's like to work in a policing environment. But I think it's important to point out that a lot of the incidents of misconduct that have been brought to light aren't only because one or two officers decided to make up their own rules.
So when it comes to wrongful convictions, there are many examples of this where supervisors may have turned a blind eye to questionable policing practices, senior officers signing off on questionable paperwork. When we think of Mr. Big operations, for example, in each of these instances, officers were working in an environment where there were assumptions about how good cases are built. And so officers do what they have to do to meet these expectations. Again, you can get more in-depth information into Mr. Big Stings in our episode about Mr. Big Stings called This Is Going to Sting a Little.
And when you put it all together, it's a great recipe for a wrongful conviction because the system's stacked against you. The people who are supposed to be protecting you are actually more interested in protecting themselves and following their own ideas of what's right and wrong.
So let's hook back to the case with the first trial ending in a mistrial. The Crown elected to retry him, and the second trial began in late February. The jury was not as understanding as the first, and this trial ended in a wrongful conviction. So Thomas appealed the conviction, arguing that the judge didn't present his defense to the jury properly. This meant that he didn't get a fair trial. The Court of Appeals agreed with him and ordered a new trial. The third trial began in early February, and again, he was found guilty. So again, Thomas appealed, arguing that once again, the trial judge didn't present his theory of the crime adequately to the jury, which deprived him of the right to a fair trial. Again, the Court of Appeals agreed. This time, however, the court concluded that because he had gone through 3 trials and had spent 45 months in custody, he would not be subjected to another trial. It was in their view that justice would be best served by acquitting Thomas Sophonow rather than making him stand trial for a 4th trial. On December 12th, 1985, 4 years after the murder, Thomas was formally acquitted. Although he was now free from prison and from the threat of being prosecuted again, his reputation had not been cleared. He continued to receive threats to the point that his house was firebombed.
So while he was acquitted, Thomas had not been exonerated, and he felt that this was necessary to assure the community that he had not murdered Barb Stoppel. It would take another 5 years for Thomas to fully clear his name. And it was at this time that the Winnipeg Police Service finally announced that Thomas was not responsible for the murder that had taken place almost 10 years earlier. The Attorney General of Manitoba echoed this sentiment and apologized to Thomas for the 3 trials, the appeals, and the 45 months in jail that he had to endure for an offense that he did not commit. A commission of inquiry was called to look into what caused Thomas's wrongful conviction. And a list of contributing factors came out of the inquiry, and as a result, it was recommended that Thomas be compensated for the time that he had wrongfully spent in prison and for the psychological trauma that he endured as a result. And he was granted $2.3 million in compensation.
So Thomas now lives in British Columbia with his second wife and their 3 children. He's been diagnosed as suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. No surprise. That may never be alleviated. Because of his diagnosis, he has decided against returning to full-time employment and has lived largely off his compensation. But still a tragic story in so many ways.
It really is. And it's one that could have and should have been avoided.
So how do we do that?
How do we avoid it? Well, we can start by acknowledging that police misconduct is a very real source of wrongful convictions. I've been studying in this area for a long time, and police misconduct is, it's usually talked around like it contributes to false confessions and it contributes to tunnel vision, or, it contributes to faulty eyewitness statements, but it's never pulled out and looked at on its own. And it's really time to change that. We've been really busy looking into how to reform things like eyewitness procedures and interrogation procedures. But, it's time we look at procedural reforms that will reduce the incidence of misconduct across our police forces. We need accountability measures to make sure that people are held responsible when they do step out of line.
I mean, maybe we need to consider how much discretion and supervision officers have. If no one's watching them, how can they be held accountable for their actions? Maybe we need external review boards. Let's not have the police policing the police.
Yeah. And, again, maybe it's because I'm a lifelong student, but I always think education is key. And, my poor sister, I always use her as an example, but, she knows it's because I love her. And she is an example. She's a great example of how education does work. She's one of the most sincere and genuine people that I know. And she has a ton of integrity. And, she's always super careful when she does her job because she's all too familiar with what I study and what I teach. And, she appreciates how things can go wrong if she doesn't do her job right. And, because she knows about this ugly underbelly, she is vigilant to guard against it. And she always tells me that she doesn't want to be the case that I'm talking about when I teach my next class. And, every time she says it, it resonates with me because it really speaks to how important education is. You can't guard against something if you don't know it even exists.
As the old saying goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely. If history has taught us anything, no one is immune to this. So when you find yourself dealing with someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them, know that they most certainly do, which is a good thing because we all share the same rights.
The world of wrongful convictions is a living hell for individuals who end up in it. And believe it or not, it could happen to anyone. Know the law, know how to look for flaws in the system, understand how marginalization works, and most of all, talk about it. Thanks for listening. I'm Kelly Lozon.
And I'm Kelly Fanson. We'd like to thank our guests for their insight, stories, and expertise. And we'd like to thank you, our listeners, for your interest in the world of wrongful convictions and for sharing our podcast. For more information on wrongful convictions, visit our website at realliferongs.com and email us at hello@realliferongs.com. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and anywhere you find podcasts. Real Life Wrongs is produced by Kelly Fanson, edited by Alex Glutch, promotional materials by Jamie Norrie.
All of us could falsely confess to something.
They blew it all out of proportion, and they got away with it.
Even a country like Canada has people who are charged and convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
There's innocent people who are going to die in prison.
I can't get back the time that they took from me.
And I was just left wondering, what the hell is happening?
I knew my life was over right there. That's when my life ended.
They're changing the story that I told them to match to what really happened.
I was just incarcerated for 37 years for somebody else's crime.
That what happened to me could easily happen